when Everett Keene looked me in the eyes and said, "People like you should know their place." Something in me cracked quietly, but deep enough to sting for years. My name is Elodie Varon. And that night, I realized a painful truth. Some wounds don't come from strangers. They come from the people who think they're entitled to judge your worth. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. But I made one silent promise in that moment one day. The man who dismissed me would learn exactly who I really was. I followed Nola up the steps toward the Keene's house, trying not to show how out of place I already felt. Inside, the rooms glowed with warm light and polished confidence, quiet conversations, soft laughter, the kind of elegance that didn't need to announce itself. Nola fit in easily, drifting toward her future in-laws with a smile that lit up her whole face. I stayed a half step behind her, settling near the edges where I could observe without being pulled into anything. My blazer suddenly felt too plain, but I kept my shoulders straight. I'd learned long ago that blending in was safer than pushing forward. Then Everett Keene approached. He looked at me the way people look at a menu item they never intend to order: brief, dismissive, already moving on. His gaze swept from my shoes to my face before shifting away, as if he'd confirmed whatever assumption he'd walked in with. I opened my mouth to greet him, but he'd already redirected his attention to someone he actually wanted to talk to. I didn't take it personally. Disregard from a stranger wasn't new. Ethan, at least, was kind, warm handshake, genuine questions, an ease that softened the tension his father left hanging. But the air in that house vibrated with something subtle and unmistakable, like a quiet warning humming under the surface. Later, when Nola slipped back to my side and whispered that she hoped they'd learn to like me, even though it didn't seem promising, the words landed heavier than she meant them to, and in that moment, I knew the night had only just begun. The morning after the Keenes' gathering, I sat alone in my Capitol Hill apartment, with the kind of quiet that presses on your ribs. My eyes drifted to the bulletin board above my desk, to the photo pinned at the top corner. 6 of us stood in a row, arms slung over each other's shoulders, soot staining our uniforms, exhaustion and adrenaline written all over our faces. Only 5 of them are still alive. The gap where one smile should have been is the part I never stopped seeing. Nola never asked why I stayed in Seattle when everyone else in my field moved on to bigger stages. She never questioned why I turned down a position in DC, why I avoided every public recognition event, why I stepped back whenever people tried to shine a light on anything I'd done. She didn't know the details, but she understood enough to leave my silence alone. But silence does not mean forgetting. My mind returned, as it always does, to that night in 2017, the inferno tearing through an Oregon mountainside. The thrum of rotors as a rescue helicopter lifted into a sky that glowed the color of danger. I'd been the last voice in the pilot's headset. I'd heard the shift in wind, the sudden distortion in the line, the violent pull of nature when it turns. Then came the silence, not peaceful, final, the kind of silence that takes root inside you and never entirely leaves. That was the night I learned that not every loss gets to be mourned out loud. Some stay tucked behind ribs and stitched between breaths. A sharp ping from my laptop cut through my thoughts. It was an alert from SECC, a storm system developing off the coast, projected to hit within 48 hours. Prepare for mandatory extended shifts, almost immediately. My phone buzzed with a message from Nola. "Everett wants us to come to dinner tonight. He says he wants to understand you better." I sat back in my chair. There are people who want to understand you. And then there are people who want to evaluate you. I already knew which category Everett belonged to. The restaurant Everett chose overlooked the lake, the kind of place where a single dinner bill could pay someone's rent. Warm lights glowed against dark windows, and waitstaff moved quietly, trained to disappear unless summoned. Everett stood as we approached, offering a handshake that barely grazed my fingers before he settled back into his chair with the confidence of someone who had never once felt small. "Seattle emergency? Coordination?" he asked, tilting his head, studying me with polite disinterest. "Sounds demanding." I kept my tone even as I said I was used to demanding work. He gave a thin smile, the kind people use when they're trying to soften an insult but don't care enough to succeed. "Not exactly the world my family moves in, but if it suits you." Nola shot me a look, silently urging me to engage. But I stayed quiet. There was nothing I could say that he wanted to hear. Then Ethan, in an attempt to ease the tension, mentioned his father just wanted Nola living somewhere safe. Everett's eyes slid toward me, cold and precise. I kept my spine straight as I told him I wasn't a danger to anyone, that all I wanted was Nola's happiness. He didn't argue. He didn't acknowledge it either. He simply lifted his glass as if dismissing the entire exchange. When we stepped outside after dinner, the air had cooled sharply. I caught Everett's voice drifting toward me as he spoke to Ethan. You need to think long-term. Our family's future is too important to let outside elements complicate things. I didn't need to turn around to understand exactly who the complication was. The storm hit hours earlier than anyone predicted. By the time night settled over Seattle, SECC was running at Level 4 activation, the highest crisis threshold we had. I'd been in the command room since late afternoon, my eyes burning from the constant flicker of weather maps, turning from deep blue to violent red. Every siren, every alert, every flashing notification meant someone out there was one mistake away from becoming a casualty. I barely had time to finish coordinating an evacuation from a nursing center before my personal phone buzzed. Seeing Nola's name instantly chilled my stomach. Her voice crackled with panic, thin and shaky like she was 14 again. Elodie, we're stuck. Ethan tried to get to his dad's house. The road by the lake is blocked. The car won't move. It won't move at all. I shot up from my chair so fast it scraped across the floor. At the same moment, one of the main monitors turned black, then another. A system-wide alert blinked across the feed signal loss across the entire Lake Washington zone. The first knot tightened inside me. When the satellite link sputtered back to life, the GPS on their car flickered violently between coordinates. They were less than 200 feet from last year's slide zone. The second knot pulled tighter. I radioed the county rescue unit, but they refused deployment. Winds were too high, visibility too low, the risk of a rollover too great. That was the third knot sharp enough to steal my breath. The screens in front of me blurred as my mind snapped back to Oregon 2017. The static on the radio, the shift in the pilot's breathing, the way the world seemed to pause right before the line went dead. My heart beat so hard the sound drowned out the storm outside. Not again. Not her. I grabbed the emergency radio unit and switched frequencies. My voice came out lower than I expected, steady in a way that felt borrowed from an older version of myself. Varen mainline. Activate Volunteer Unit 2. Immediate deployment to Lake Washington. No one in that room knew that Unit 2 existed because I'd built it quietly, funded it myself, trained it myself, because I never wanted to lose someone the way I had before. Minutes later, their lead came through the radio. Breathless. Varen! Ground slide starting. We need coordinates now! I typed with shaking fingers, scanning soil shift indicators climbing higher and higher. The land was moving beneath them. There are 2 people trapped in that car, I said. One of them is my sister. Keep your line safe and follow my route. I'll guide you the whole way. Silence. Then, copy that? Moving in. I pressed my forehead to the mic and walked them through at the path, meter by meter, as the wind howled against the building. Each command felt like stitching together 2 breaking worlds. Nola's fear and my need to keep her alive. When the radio finally crackled with the words, "We've got them," my entire body collapsed back into the chair. My hands trembled, but for the first time in years, my heart didn't feel like a weight dragging me under. Tonight, at least, I had not failed the people I loved. By the time I reached the hospital, the storm's edge had passed, leaving the air thick with the metallic scent of rain and ozone. My hair clung to my face, my jacket still damp. Nola sat on the exam table, wrapped in a blanket, while Ethan hovered close. His relief so raw it softened the exhaustion in his eyes. He stepped forward and pulled me into a tight, shaking hug. "You saved us." I gave a small nod. "I only did my job. Nothing more." But peace never lasts around the Keens. The door swung open, and Everett strode in wearing a charcoal overcoat, Storm still clinging to his shoulders. His face was flushed not from worry, but fury. He didn't look at Ethan. He didn't look at Nola. He came straight for me. You caused chaos across the city with your overreaction, he snapped. Roads shut down because of your decision-making, and my son almost died because of it. The words didn't hurt. The way he looked at me did, like I was a disruption, not the reason his son was standing upright in that room. He believed the road closure had put Ethan in danger, never realizing I'd ordered it to prevent cars from sliding straight into the collapse zone. Nola exploded before I could speak, tears streaking her cheeks. Dad, she saved us. You don't know what you're talking about. He turned away from her, refusing to let the truth rearrange the anger he'd already chosen. A pair of nurses passed by the doorway, whispering to each other. One of them glanced at me, recognition widening her eyes. Wasn't she the one on the main line last night? Varen Everett heard it, but dismissed it instantly. Coincidence, he muttered. I could have corrected him. I could have defended myself. But the truth is, explanations mean nothing to someone committed to the wrong story. So I stayed silent. Seattle's wet pavement reflected the silver glow of streetlights as I stepped outside. I stood beneath the awning for a long moment, letting the cold air settle my pulse. The people I save never owe me anything, but somehow, the ones who resent being saved hurt the most. Before walking away, I reached up and touched the small SECC pin tucked beneath my collar, the only piece of that night, of all my nights, that I let myself keep close. One day, Everett Keene would have to face it, face me. When I returned to my apartment that night, exhaustion clung to me, but sleep stayed far away. My phone lit up again, Nola asking us to come to dinner because her father wanted to talk. Something in her wording chilled me. I'd felt storms like this before, the kind that didn't show up on radar. Walking into the Keynes' dining room felt like stepping into a museum of restraint. The table was perfectly set, the room warm and polished, yet sharper than any courtroom. Everett sat at the head, back straight, hands clasped, wearing the expression of a man preparing to pass judgment rather than share a meal. He started by brushing off the previous night, saying storms were always dangerous and no one needed to make them into something more dramatic. His tone made my stomach tighten. He wasn't just minimizing what happened, he was rewriting reality to fit the version he could tolerate. Then came the first blow. He said he'd heard the coordination center made questionable calls, including the road closure by the lake, and paused just long enough before stating that I seemed to be involved. I set my glass down and kept my voice calm as I told him my decisions were based on geological data. Before I could explain, Nola tried to defend me, only for Everett to silence her with a command so sharp it made the room flinch. Memories of Oregon surged through me, the helpless moment when radio static replaced my teammate's voice. I looked at Nola and felt a deep twist in my chest. The thought of her relying on someone who refused to see her truth made something old and raw surface inside me. Then Ethan placed his chopsticks down, quietly insisting his father only meant to protect them, but even he couldn't hide the confusion building behind his eyes. It was the first crack in their wall. Everett leaned forward, delivering the third hit with cold precision. Some people didn't know their place. The words dropped like a stone in water, sending ripples of shock across the table. Nola shot to her feet, her chair screeching across the floor as she demanded he stop talking to me that way. Before I could speak, a house staff member entered, saying someone needed confirmation of the rescue lead's name from the previous night. The name Varen Mainline spilled into the room like lightning. Everett stared at me, confused. I stared back, waiting for him to understand. He didn't. I stood and thanked them for the dinner, saying they no longer needed me there. And as I walked out, the weight of their silence followed me down the hall. Nola showed up at my door later that night, eyes swollen, insisting I tell them who I really was. I held her close and told her I didn't need anything from them, only her safety. She cried harder, and I felt something inside me soften and ache at once. The next morning at SECC, the chaos felt grounding radio chatter, shifting maps, staff rushing past. It reminded me there were places where my presence wasn't questioned but relied on. I was reviewing storm logs when Ethan walked in, soaked from the rain, asking to talk. In the briefing room, he admitted someone sent him a recording from the rescue. He'd heard my voice guiding the team, His hands shook as he said I was the reason he and Nola were alive. When he handed me his phone, hearing my own voice echo back firm, focused, felt like looking at a version of myself I tried to bury. He then said his father had heard a short clip too, but refused to believe it. I wasn't surprised. Before I could respond, Nola entered with a small box she'd found hidden in my closet, the memorial pin, the Oregon letter, my first badge, the burned map. The room felt smaller around us. A staff member rushed in to say rescue teams were invited to the rehearsal dinner that evening, and Everett had specifically requested to meet the lead coordinator. Ethan looked at me with dawning clarity. I closed the box softly, the old SECC badge warm in my hand. Tonight, everything would shift. The venue by the lake glowed as if nothing in the world could disturb its perfect warmth. Soft music drifting, glasses chiming, guests laughing under golden lights. I stood just outside the doors, fingers tightening around the edge of my blazer. It wasn't fear holding me still. It was the quiet certainty that the moment I stepped in, the ground beneath all of us would shift. Inside, Everett stood in the center, microphone in hand, speaking with the confidence of a man used to owning a room. He announced that the person who saved his son and Nola was here tonight, and the crowd applauded politely. Behind the door, I heard Nola release a shaky breath. Then he invited the coordinator to come forward. Silence pressed down on the room. I pushed the door open. The sound cut through the air like a blade. Heads turned. Ethan's face drained of color. Nola clutched his hand. Everett stared at me, confusion flickering into dawning horror. 3 long seconds. No one breathed. I walked toward him and said he had called for the coordinator and I was here. Shock rippled across the guests. Nola sobbed. Voices whispered. Someone from SECC stood up, recognizing my voice. Then Ethan played the recording, my commands echoing through the speakers, sharp and unmistakable. The room went still. Everett's expression crumbled. I told them I hadn't sought praise only to protect the people I loved. The microphone slipped from his hand as everything he believed faltered. I stood near the long banquet table, feeling the weight of my old SECC pin burning through the lining of my blazer as if it wanted to reveal itself. Everett approached slowly, none of the polished confidence he wore earlier remaining. His shoulders sagged, his eyes unsteady, and for the first time, he looked less like a man of influence and more like a father trying to understand a truth too heavy to hold. He said my name with a rawness that startled me, then asked why I had never told him. I held his gaze and answered calmly that I never did the work to be recognized. The words stopped him cold, stripped him of any argument. He started to apologize for the things he had said, but I cut in gently, telling him he wasn't familiar with people like me, and unfamiliar didn't mean lesser. His head bowed, guilt settling over him like a physical weight. Ethan stepped forward then, voice firmer than I'd ever heard, telling his father I had saved his life. Everett swallowed hard before forcing out an apology. Around us, the room fell into a hush, witnessing a man built on authority finally bending to truth. Then Everett revealed the folder, his plan to interfere with the wedding finances, and announced he was stepping back completely. His apology came in action. Not words. Nola threw her arms around Ethan, then ran to me, sobbing that I was the strongest person she knew. I told her I'd only stood where she needed me. And just like that, the tension in the room eased, the storm finally breaking. The wedding unfolded along the edge of Lake Washington, the same shoreline that had nearly stolen everything not long ago. Sunlight scattered across the water in bright, trembling arcs, turning each small wave into a moving ribbon of light. I stayed toward the back row, exactly where I felt most at ease. No one pulled me forward. No one asked me to speak. And no one waited for me to prove anything. The quiet suited me. When Nola stepped out, she looked lighter than I had ever seen her. She scanned the crowd until her eyes found mine, and the smile she gave me held every answer I'd ever needed. Every long shift, every silent burden, every moment I'd chosen her over myself, it all came together in that one look. Ethan took her hand, and the warmth between them spread like sunlight across the aisle. Their future felt bright enough to touch. Everett approached me without urgency, his step steady, his expression softer than I'd ever known it. He stood beside me, both of us facing the lake. He thanked me quietly, not just for saving his son, but for opening his eyes to the limits of his own judgment. I let the silence stretch before answering that their happiness was all that mattered. He nodded, accepting it fully. Music drifted over the ceremony as a gentle breeze skimmed the surface of the lake, as if washing away the last remnants of old wounds. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, not in triumph, not in pride, but in genuine peace, the kind I hadn't felt in years. Sunlight shimmered across the water, closing the story exactly as it should, quietly, steadily, beautifully.